I have always believed that a person is not defined by the contents of their bank account, but by the contents of their character. That may sound like hackneyed wisdom from those motivational posters that hang in offices, but for me it has been the foundation of my entire life. My name is Benjamin Eddington. I'm 62 years old, and for nearly 4 decades I've stuck to one simple rule. Money is a tool, not an end in itself. The Boynton Beach sun was beating down mercilessly as I turned off the engine of my 7-year-old Toyota in the parking lot of the Ocean Drive Business Center, an unremarkable 3-story glass and concrete building from the 90s, where my company, Eddington Technology Investments, occupied a modest office on the second floor. No marble lobbies, designer furniture, or paintings by contemporary artists. Just a functional space with the bare minimum. 4 desks, reliable computers, a coffee maker, and a meeting room where we met with clients. If you were to stop by, you'd never guess that we manage an investment portfolio worth over $1 billion from here. Our team is just 5 people, including myself. Emily, my assistant, has been with me for 15 years. Robert and Lisa are financial analysts who chose our small firm over the corporate giants, and Paul is a technology sector specialist who once worked for one of Silicon Valley's largest companies before burnout and frustration with the corporate culture brought him to me. Sharon Array. Good morning, Ben. Emily greeted me with a cup of black coffee, as always. 10 o'clock call from Neoquant today. Their new machine learning algorithm has shown phenomenal results in beta testing. I nodded, accepting my coffee. Neoquant is a typical example of the kinds of companies we invest in. A small team of brilliant programmers with a revolutionary idea that needs capital and strategic guidance. We provide both without asking for a controlling stake or board seat in return. I believe in people and their ability to change the world if you give them a chance and don't get in the way. In 35 years, this approach has made me more money than I will ever be able to spend. Not that I've tried. My closet consists of a dozen nearly identical shirts, 5 suits from a mid-range tailor, and 2 pairs of comfortable but unremarkable shoes. My apartment is a 2-bedroom suite overlooking the ocean, but without the frills that people of my means usually surround themselves with. No personal airplane, just a membership in a small flying club where I occasionally rent a Cessna to fly over the coast. No yacht, just an old boat that I fix up myself every spring. The only real luxury I allow myself is rare books, a collection of which I have been collecting for over 20 years. Also on the line is James, said it was urgent, Emily added, handing me a sticker with a number on it. I felt something in my chest clench. James, my only son, rarely called for nothing. Our relationship had never been easy, especially since the death of Laura, his mother, 10 years ago. Different outlooks on life, different values, different paths. He chose New York, corporate law, designer suits, and social events. I stayed true to Florida, my business and my philosophy. I closed the office door and dialed the number. Father. James's voice sounded upbeat, but with that tense note that came out whenever he was about to say something important. I have news. I'm listening, I said, looking out the window at the ocean, at the white yachts at the marina dock. I'm proposing to Clara Richardson, he said with an intonation that sounded like a name that should have made me jump with excitement. The Richardsons. I'd heard the name in the context of Wall Street, a financial dynasty, the 3rd or 4th generation of bankers. That my son was dating a member of such a family was predictable. James had always been attracted to glitz, prestige, what he considered high society. Congratulations, I said calmly. I hope you're happy. Of course I'm happy. There was impatience in his voice. This is a tremendous opportunity. Clara's father, Richard Richardson, is a senior partner at Richardson and Klein. Do you realize what this means for my career? I did. Career. Always a career. Always the next step. Always looking up at those who stand above, who can help climb. Never looking away or back at those left behind. James, I wasn't asking about your career. I was asking about your feelings for the girl. Pause. Of course I love Clara. His tone became a little more subdued. She's smart, educated, has great taste. We're perfect for each other. We're right for each other. Not can't live without her or she's my soulmate. Just we fit together. Like the suit fits the shirt or the shoes fit the belt. I suppressed a sigh. Huh. Anyway, he continued, clearly in a hurry to get to the main purpose of his call. In 2 weeks, the families will officially meet. Nothing fancy, just dinner at Le Bernardin. The Richardsons want to meet you. Le Bernardin, one of the most expensive restaurants in New York, of course. I'll fly in, I said simply. Good, he sounded relieved. And Father, I know you have your own views on the way you dress and all that, but this is a very important night. The Richardsons, they're very attentive to detail. Maybe you could what? I asked when he hesitated. Try to look presentable, he finally finished. I can send you my tailor's contacts. He'll be able to make something suitable in the meantime. I felt a wave of frustration rising inside me. Not anger. It takes passion to be angry, and our relationship had long since devolved into a quiet, chronic pain. I have a suit, James, I said calmly. Yeah, but he hesitated again. It's just that these are very important people, Father. I don't want them to think that I'm a poor hick, I finished for him. No, 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 of course not. It's just that first impressions are very important. Ah, don't worry, James. I won't embarrass you in front of your future relatives. He didn't catch the irony in my voice. Thank you, Father. I'll send you the flight and hotel details. I'm in a meeting right now. I've got to run. And he disconnected without even waiting for my goodbye. I put the phone away and stared at the ocean for a few minutes. Somewhere out there, far out on the horizon, a cargo ship was slowly moving toward the harbor, so small from here, from the shore. I wondered what I looked like to my son from the top of his New York penthouse. Just as insignificant a speck on the horizon? Emily knocked and peeked into the office. Ben, Nia Quant is on the line, ready to begin the presentation. I nodded, pushing thoughts of James away and returning to what I really understood. Business, numbers, concrete things that could be measured and evaluated. An hour later, after a successful conversation with Nia Quant, we decided to invest $5 million in their development. My thoughts returned to my upcoming meeting with the Richardsons. Should I play along with James, order a new suit, try to make the right impression, or stay myself at the risk of angering and displeasing him? Laura would know what to do. She had always found the perfect balance between principles and flexibility. Be yourself, but remember you're doing it for him, she would say. And then she would add something wise about how true generosity is sometimes found in giving in small things for the good of those you love. But Laura was gone, and I remained as I had always been, straightforward, a little stubborn, true to my principles. And those principles told me that if my son's future in-laws judged me by the cost of my suit rather than the content of my character, that was their problem, not mine. I looked out of the office. Emily, please book me a ticket to New York in 2 weeks. I'll let you know the exact date as soon as James sends the details. She nodded, making a note in her day planner. Work-related? No, I answered with a slight chuckle. A more complicated matter, a family matter. The rest of the day passed in the usual rhythm: meetings, calls, market analysis, discussion of new investment opportunities. But somewhere in the back of my mind was the thought of my upcoming meeting with the Richardsons and the discomfort James felt at the thought of me meeting very important people. When I got home and sat on the balcony with a glass of whiskey, watching the waves lapping against the shore, I remembered the first time I had brought James to the ocean. He had been 4 years old, and he had looked out at the vast expanse of water with such awe, such pure, unadulterated joy. When did we lose exactly that? The ability to look at the world with admiration rather than an evaluative squint. When did my boy stop seeing the beauty in simple things and start measuring everything with price tags and prestige? Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I spent too much time on work and not enough on him. Maybe I failed to convey to him my view of money as a tool, not as an indicator of status. Or maybe it's just a path he has to take to eventually come to the same conclusions as me, but by his own route. Either way, I was due to fly to New York in 2 weeks and meet a family for whom I was pretty sure I wouldn't look presentable enough. And it wasn't just the suit. It was about that fundamental difference in values that I feared would be obvious at first glance. I sipped my whiskey and decided I wasn't going to order a new suit after all. If James was ashamed of me for who I was, it wasn't my closet, it was our relationship. And a new suit from the fanciest tailor wasn't going to fix that. New York City greeted me with a chilly October dampness. I stepped out of the terminal at LaGuardia Airport and turned up the collar of my coat to shield myself from the gusts of wind. The sky was overhanging heavy gray clouds, promising rain by evening. Typical New York fall, cold, unfriendly, and hurried. The cab driver, an elderly Sikh with a neatly trimmed gray beard, helped me load my suitcase into the trunk. I gave him the address of the Manhattan hotel I'd booked against James's insistence that I stay with him. I needed privacy, a place to think before my upcoming dinner with the Richardsons. "First time in the city?" the driver asked, maneuvering deftly through the dense traffic on the Van Wyck Highway. "No," I answered, looking at the high-rise buildings of Queens floating by. "Sherbrooke. I lived here when I was young. I come here often on business." "Oh, so you know New York," he smiled in the rearview mirror. "Then I won't bore you with stories about the Brooklyn Bridge and the Statue of Liberty." I smiled back. Strangely, I felt more comfortable with this stranger than I did with my own son. No expectations, no disappointment, no need to conform to someone else's standards. The Carlton Hotel was located on 26th Street in a relatively quiet corner of Manhattan. Not luxurious, but not cheap either. Just what I preferred. A spacious room overlooking Madison Square Park, good service, and no pretentiousness. I had 3 hours before dinner at Le Bernardin. I laid out my things, showered, and pulled out my suit. Dark blue quality wool, but no designer label. A classic cut that never goes out of style, but doesn't scream trendy either. It comes with an off-white shirt and a silk tie in a muted burgundy color, the only concession to my usual minimalism. The cufflinks Laura had given me for our 20th anniversary were silver, with tiny sapphires. I realized that in the world of James and his future in-laws, such an outfit was probably considered provincial and outdated. But this was me, the real me, not trying to seem like someone else. 10 minutes before the appointed time, I was already standing outside the restaurant. It hadn't started raining, but the humidity hung in the air, making the lights of the city blur with a soft glow. Le Bernardin was located in a sleek, modern building on 51st Street, its minimalist facade contrasting with the pomp of the neighboring buildings. James showed up at precisely 7, accompanied by a young woman and a middle-aged couple, obviously the Richardsons. My son was unrecognizable, usually reserved and collected. He seemed nervous and overly animated, as if he were trying to compensate for some tension with excess energy. "Father," he exclaimed, coming toward me. His embrace was hasty and formal. "I'm glad you made it without trouble." He immediately turned to his companions. "Allow me to introduce my father, Benjamin Eddington." His bride-to-be stepped forward. Clara Richardson was a tall, slender blonde with chiseled features that could have been called beautiful if not for the slight arrogance in the expression of her eyes. She was wearing a cocktail dress by a famous designer. I recognized the distinctive silhouette from a magazine ad I'd leafed through on the plane. The cost of the outfit probably exceeded the annual rent for my office. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Eddington." Her voice was melodic but without warmth. "James has told me so much about you." I had my doubts about that. From the look on her face, my son had either said very little about me or painted a less than flattering image of me. "Likewise, Clara," I bowed slightly, ignoring the handshake. I didn't like this modern custom of women shaking hands like men. Clara looked confused for a moment, then lowered her hand awkwardly. Richard Richardson, Clara's father, stepped forward. A tall, thoroughbred man with graying temples and a commanding gaze. His suit was clearly tailor-made and cost probably as much as a small car. The thin stripes of fabric, the perfect cut, the diamond cufflinks, everything screamed money and position. "Richard Richardson," he introduced himself, shaking my hand vigorously. "Senior partner at Richardson and Klein. At last we've met. Your son is a real catch for our firm." He spoke as if James's greatest accomplishment was working for the Richardsons. "Benjamin Eddington," I replied. "Just James's father." His wife Victoria was a gaunt woman with an artificial smile and an appraising gaze. Her dress and jewelry screamed wealth with such insistence that it bordered on bad taste. "Oh, darling," she touched her husband's arm theatrically. "We must hurry or we will lose our reservation." We entered the restaurant. The interior of Le Bernardin was striking in its understated elegance. Subdued lighting, soft cream colors, impeccably set tables. We were escorted to a corner table that overlooked the entire room. "It's a beautiful place," Richard remarked as we took our seats. "I've been friends with the chef for 15 years. He never disappoints." "Yes, it's the best fish restaurant in town," Victoria said. "We come here at least once a month." It was the first of many hints about their financial situation and social status that would follow over the course of the evening. The sommelier brought the wine list, and Richard, barely glancing at it, ordered a bottle of Montrachet 2010. I knew enough about wines to know that this bottle was worth over $1,000. "You like a good white, don't you, Mr. Eddington?" he asked in a tone that implied no refusal. "Oh, I prefer whiskey," I answered honestly. "But I'd be happy to try your choice." James gave me an anxious look. I knew that look. He was afraid I'd say or do something wrong, that I'd break the invisible protocol that governed behavior in their circle. "Dad doesn't go to restaurants like this very often," he hastened to explain. "Florida, you know, has a more casual atmosphere." "Oh yes, Florida," Victoria said the name of the state as if it were some exotic backwater. "It must be peaceful." "Quite," I replied with a slight smile, "especially if you don't live in a tourist area." "What do you do in Florida, Mr. Eddington?" Richard asked as the sommelier filled our glasses. Before I could answer, James interjected. "My father runs a small investment company. Mostly local projects, right, Dad?" I looked at my son. A small investment company. Technically, that was true. Eddington Technology Investments was indeed small in terms of number of employees, but in terms of assets under management, we outperformed many much noisier Wall Street firms. "Ah, yes," I said simply. "I invest in technology startups." "Oh, how interesting." Victoria clearly didn't find that interesting. "Which ones? Maybe we've heard of them." "I doubt it," I replied. "Most of them are in the early stages of development." "My father prefers small companies," James explained again, hurriedly. "Nothing big." I sipped my wine, savoring its complex flavor with notes of citrus and minerals, and decided not to pursue the subject further. If my son wanted to portray me as a small-time provincial investor, I wasn't going to disappoint him. The conversation turned to the upcoming engagement. The Richardsons, as it turned out, were planning a grand celebration at the Plaza, one of the most expensive hotels in New York. "Shuttening. We'll invite about 200 guests," Victoria said. "Only the closest circle." I almost choked on my wine. 200 closest people. I would never have had so many people in my entire life, not even in passing. "Of course there will be live music," she continued. "We're thinking of inviting a string quartet for the cocktail part and a jazz band for dinner. How does that sound, Mr. Eddington?" "It sounds big," I replied diplomatically. "Oh, it's just an engagement party," she laughed. "The wedding, of course, will be much grander. We're thinking of the Hamptons in the summer, or maybe Tuscany." The waiter brought the first course, something exquisite with truffles and caviar. The food was excellent, but the portions were so tiny that I doubted if I'd eaten all evening. "Shrinari." "Richard, tell Mr. Eddington about our new project," Victoria suggested after we finished our appetizers. Richard perked up. "We've just purchased a building on Park Avenue, 18 stories, former headquarters of a pharmaceutical company. We plan to completely remodel it and turn it into a luxury apartment complex. The investment is about $250 million, but the payback is amazing." I nodded, analyzing the numbers in my mind. Judging by the current state of the Manhattan real estate market and its trends, the project could indeed be profitable. But there were pitfalls that Richard either didn't know about or preferred not to mention. "It's an interesting project," I said, "but aren't you concerned about the new energy efficiency regulations for buildings? They go into effect next quarter and could significantly increase the cost of remodeling." Richard froze for a moment, clearly surprised by my knowledge. "We budgeted for it," he replied, but there was a trace of uncertainty in his voice. I decided not to pursue the subject. If Richard hadn't considered the regulations, that was his problem, not mine. "Dad was always attentive to detail," James interjected. "It helped him in his modest business." I looked at my son. He avoided my gaze, preferring to study the pattern on the tablecloth. Dinner continued. Each new dish was accompanied by a waiter's detailed explanation of its composition and method of preparation. The Richardsons continued to talk about their estates, their travels, famous people in their social circle. Victoria mentioned their home in Aspen, an apartment in Paris, and a yacht on the Côte d'Azur. Richard talked about his collection of vintage cars and rare watches. All of this was presented not as bragging, but as a matter of course, as the backdrop to their daily lives. I listened to all this with polite interest, occasionally inserting a comment or asking a question, but mostly watching James. My son sat tensely, constantly shifting his gaze from me to the Richardsons, as if he feared I would say something inappropriate. He was clearly ashamed of my simple suit, my terse answers, my obvious difference from the people in their circle. When the conversation turned to travel, and I mentioned that I had recently returned from a trip to Vietnam, Victoria rounded her eyes. Vietnam? She asked with ill-concealed surprise. How exotic. Were you there on a charity mission? No, I was just traveling, I answered. I like exploring new places, getting to know different cultures. Dad always preferred unusual destinations. James intervened again. He doesn't have much of a budget for traveling, so he has to go to cheaper places. I looked at my son in surprise. This was getting out of hand. Actually, I said calmly, I can afford to go anywhere. I just didn't see the point in paying 3 times as much for the same sea and sand, but with French around. There was an awkward pause. Of course, Richard agreed hastily. There is a certain practicality. He said the word as if he were talking about some strange disease. Dessert came on fine porcelain plates, something airy with passion fruit and white chocolate. It was accompanied by a dessert wine, the name of which I did not hear. So, Mr. Eddington, Victoria took a sip of wine, do you live alone in Florida? James mentioned that his mother died 10 years ago, I finished for her. Yes, I've been alone ever since. That must be so hard, she said, living alone without support. I'm comfortable with myself, I replied, and I have friends, co-workers. I don't feel lonely. Dad was always very independent, James said, as if apologizing for that. Even when Mom was alive, he often went to work. It wasn't fair. Yes, I worked hard, but I always made time for my family. It was James who, after college, started coming home less and less, calling less and more distant. Men like your father, Richard turned to James but looked at me, are from the old school. They put everything into their work, into providing for their family. That's worthy of respect. I could hear the condescension in his words, like he was talking about an endangered species, worthy of study, but not of emulation. So the engagement is in 2 weeks. I decided to change the subject. What can I do to help with the preparations? Victoria looked at me with ill-concealed surprise. Oh, don't worry, Mr. Eddington. We'll organize everything. We have professional event planners to take care of all the details. I understand, I nodded. But as the groom's father, I'd like to do my part. The Richardsons looked at each other, clearly unsure how to respond to my suggestion. Maybe you could, Richard paused, searching for words. Make a little toast? Something sentimental about James, about your family. From his tone, he didn't expect me to do much more than make a short speech that I probably wouldn't be able to say. Sure, I agreed. I could make a toast. James looked both relieved and wary. It was as if he was afraid that even in such a simple task, I might let him down. Dinner was coming to an end. Richard paid without letting me look at the bill, though I'd insisted on splitting the cost. Not at all, he said. You're our guest in New York. Next time we're in Florida, you can show us the local restaurants. We went outside. It was starting to rain, a light drizzle that shrouded the city in a silvery haze. Richard called his driver, and a minute later a black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. We can give you a ride to the hotel, Mr. Eddington, Victoria offered. Thank you, but I'd rather walk, I replied. I like to walk in the rain. Richard looked at me as if I'd mentioned some exotic hobby. Turn it as you wish, he held out his hand to me. It was nice to meet you. I'll see you at the engagement party. Likewise, I shook his hand. Victoria and Clara said goodbye more formally. James lingered for a moment as the Richardsons got into the car. Are you sure you don't want to ride? He asked anxiously. Right, I put my hand on his shoulder. Go on, don't keep them waiting. He hesitated, clearly wanting to say something, but then he just nodded and got into the car. I watched the black Mercedes disappear into the traffic, taking my son and his future family, people to whom I was a stranger, incomprehensible, not fitting into their world. The rain intensified, but I was in no hurry to take cover. I needed time to process everything that had happened at that dinner. James was ashamed of me. It was obvious. He was ashamed of my supposed poverty, my unassuming appearance, my simplicity. He'd chosen to create an image for the Richardsons of my father as a humble provincial businessman rather than tell the truth about who I was. I walked slowly down the wet sidewalk, feeling the raindrops dripping down by my collar. Maybe I should have made things clearer. Tell the Richardsons the real extent of my business, that my modest investment firm managed assets comparable to their fortune? No. If James prefers to see me as a poor relative, so be it. Let him decide how to represent his father. But an engagement, that's another matter. I had no intention of interfering with the Richardsons' plans, but I had no intention of staying in the shadows. After all, I was the father of the groom. And if the Richardsons wanted to put on a show for their 200 closest friends, I could contribute to that show too. In the 2 weeks since I'd met the Richardsons, I'd given it a lot of thought and made a decision. Since my son wants to see me as a humble provincial businessman, well, I'll give it to him, but on my terms. I was not going to make a scandal at the engagement, but I did not intend to play the role of a pauper relative. Back in Florida, I called Paul, my technology analyst, and instructed him to prepare a large transaction. 510,000, are you sure? He asked, clearly surprised by the specificity of the amount. Absolutely, I confirmed. Anonymous. And I want it to be as official as possible with an itemized invoice. I then contacted the Richardson event organizer, introducing myself as the Eddington family's financial advisor. The conversation was short and businesslike. After all, the money speaks for itself, and I was offering to pay for the entire event in full. Sir, Mr. Eddington, the girl organizer's voice sounded surprised. The Richardsons have already made a deposit and— I understand, I interrupted. Give them the deposit back. I'll take care of all the expenses. All right, she agreed after a pause. But I'll have to coordinate it with them. No, I stopped her again. Consider it a surprise. At the end of the evening, before the toast, you'll hand the microphone to me, and I'll explain everything myself. She hesitated, but my offer was too generous to refuse. As you wish, Mr. Eddington. For the next 2 weeks, I was immersed in my work more than usual. Maybe it was my way of distracting myself from the upcoming event, or maybe it was simple coincidence. Neoquant was launching its new algorithm, and the results exceeded expectations. Our investments started to bear fruit sooner than we expected. 2 other companies in our portfolio received takeover offers from major tech giants. The market was booming, and our long-term investment strategy was right. Things were going so well that I almost forgot about my upcoming engagement. Almost. A nagging sense of disappointment in my relationship with my son kept me from finally sinking into my work. On the day of the engagement, I took an early flight to New York. This time I stayed at the Plaza, the very hotel where the celebration was to take place. My room was spacious and luxurious, overlooking Central Park. Gilded details, antique furniture, marble bathroom. Everything screamed money and prestige. Not my style, but I decided I could put up with this ostentatious luxury for one day. I pulled out my suit, the same one I'd worn to dinner with the Richardsons. Tight, clean, but still as simple and unassuming. I could have ordered a new one to match the occasion, but I decided to stay true to myself. After all, it wasn't about the clothes, it was about what I was going to do. The engagement was set for 7 in the evening in the grand ballroom of the hotel. I went down to the lobby half an hour before it started. The first guests had already begun to arrive. Men in perfectly fitting tuxedos, women in evening gowns, sparkling jewelry, muffled laughter, an atmosphere of well-being and chosenness. I approached the front desk, where an elegant young woman with a clipboard was checking invitations. Benjamin Eddington, I introduced myself. She quickly looked through the list, found my name, and smiled. Welcome, Mr. Eddington. Please come in. The grand ballroom was decorated in a royal fashion, high ceilings with crystal chandeliers, exquisite floral arrangements on every table, a string quartet playing classical pieces in the corner of the room, waiters with trays of champagne glasses and canapes that looked more like works of art than food. I took a glass of champagne and stepped back to the window, watching the arriving guests. Most of them were clearly members of the Richardson circle, well-dressed, confident people with that peculiar expression on their faces that only comes from those who have never worried about money. James and Clara appeared at 8, accompanied by the Richardsons. They entered the hall like royalty, greeting guests and accepting congratulations. Clara looked stunning in a gown by a famous designer that appeared to have been made especially for her. James, in an impeccable tuxedo, stood beside her, beaming with pride and happiness. I took my time approaching them, preferring to watch from a distance. At one point, our gazes met, and James gave me a slight nod, but made no attempt to approach. He was too busy socializing with the Richardsons' guests, many of whom appeared to be influential figures in the world of finance and law. A middle-aged woman in an elegant black dress approached me. "You must be James's father," she said with a slight smile. "I'm Susan Klein, Richard's partner in the firm." "Benjamin Eddington." I shook her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "James is an excellent lawyer," she continued. "Wesha, one of the most promising in our firm. You should be proud of him." "I am," I replied sincerely. "And how are you enjoying New York?" "James mentioned you were from Florida." "New York is as beautiful as ever," I said. "I lived here when I was young, so it's not a foreign city to me." She looked a little surprised. "Really? James never mentioned it. He said you spent your whole life in Florida." "That wasn't true. I didn't move to Florida until after James was born. Before that, Laura and I lived in New York, where I started my business." "Apparently, he'd forgotten," I replied neutrally. Our conversation was interrupted by James, who finally decided to introduce me to some of the guests. "Dad," he walked up to me with a strained smile, "I want you to meet some of our friends." He was followed by a group of people, all in evening gowns, all with the same expression of well-being on their faces. "This is my father," James began, but was interrupted by a question from one of the men. "The investor from Florida? Richard mentioned you." I noticed James tense up. "Yeah, my dad lives in Boynton Beach," he said hurriedly. "He's my uncle, actually. My mother's brother. But he raised me after she died, so I consider him my father." I froze, not believing my ears. Uncle? Laura's brother? James wasn't just trying to downplay my status. He was actually disowning me as a father. "How nice," one of the women exclaimed. "A real family man." "Yes," James said, relieved. "He's always been there for me. A simple, dependable Uncle Ben from Florida." I looked at my son, not knowing what to say. The shock of his words was so intense that I was speechless for a moment. "I'm sorry." I finally came up with an answer. "I need to step outside for a minute." I stepped back, feeling the anger building up inside. Not just anger, disappointment, resentment, incomprehension. How could my own son do this? How could he disown me, even in such a socially acceptable way? I stepped out into the hallway, trying to gather my thoughts. Part of me wanted to leave this place immediately, go back to the hotel, pack my bags, and fly to Florida. But the other part, the more rational part, reminded me of the plan I had made, of what I was going to do. I took a deep breath and returned to the lounge. The evening continued. The guests danced, socialized, ate gourmet hors d'oeuvres, and drank expensive champagne. James and Clara were the center of attention, accepting congratulations and gifts. The Richardsons circled the room, introducing their daughter and future son-in-law to the important guests. I kept to the sidelines, watching the whole spectacle with growing alienation. Several times the guests came up to me, introduced themselves, chatted politely, and walked away, obviously not finding anything interesting about me. Uncle from Florida was not worth their attention. At one point, I noticed Victoria Richardson leaning over to her friend and whispering something, looking in my direction. Her friend giggled and cast an appraising glance at me. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language spoke for itself. They were discussing me, and not in the most flattering way. Richard Richardson wasn't left out either. Passing me with a group of men, he said loudly, "Here comes our guest from sunny Florida. How do you like our little party?" "Impressive," I replied with restraint. "Yes, we didn't skimp," he laughed, winking at his companions. "It's probably too extravagant for you, though, huh?" "To each his own," I said, trying to maintain my dignity. "Exactly," he exclaimed, clapping me on the shoulder. "To each his own. Some people like the plaza and champagne, others like a modest backyard barbecue." His companions laughed politely. I kept a nonchalant expression on my face, But inside, I was boiling with anger and frustration. Not because of Richard's condescension. His opinion meant little to me. It was because my son had let it all happen. What's more, he was encouraging this attitude toward me with his behavior. Finally, it was time for the official part of the evening. The guests were invited to take their places at the tables. I got a table in the far corner of the room with people I was seeing for the first time in my life. Neither James nor Clara nor the Richardsons even thought to seat me closer to the main table. The speeches began. Richard gave a lengthy speech about love, family, and tradition. Victoria told some touching stories from Clara's childhood. Friends of the young ones came out one by one, sharing memories and wishes. Everything was predictable, smooth, and impersonal, as if written on a template. Finally, the host of the evening, a young man in a tuxedo with a perfect smile, announced, "And now I would like to thank those who made this evening possible. Richard and Victoria Richardson, your generosity and love for your daughter." I saw the girl organizer walk up to him and whisper something in his ear. The host looked surprised but quickly regained a professional expression. "I apologize, ladies and gentlemen," he said. "I have just been informed that we have another important guest who would like to say a few words. Mr. Benjamin Eddington, James's father, please join me on stage." A whisper ran through the auditorium. I noticed James tense up, and a look of bewilderment appeared on Richard's face. I stood up and made my way towards the stage, feeling the stares of everyone present. Stepping up to the podium, I took the microphone from the presenter. Behind me, a table detailing the costs of the event appeared on a large screen. At the very bottom, in bold print, was highlighted the total amount: $510,000. "Good evening," I began calmly. "Chanterfree. For those who don't know, I'm Benjamin Eddington, not James's uncle, as some have been told, but his father." I paused, looking directly at my son, who had gone pale and looked like he wanted to fall through the ground. "I run an investment company in Boynton Beach, Florida. Not modest or small, but quite successful. So successful that I can afford to pay for this evening," which I did. A surprised whisper ran through the room. The Richardsons looked shocked, their faces frozen in an expression of disbelief. On the screen behind me, you can see the itemized expenses: $510,000. That's a lot of money for one night, but as Richard said, to each his own. To some, a modest backyard barbecue. To others, the opportunity to pay in full for their son's engagement, even if he's ashamed to admit who his real father is. I paused once more, giving the words a chance to penetrate the minds of those present. I could tell you about my business, about the companies I've invested in that are now leaders in their fields. I could mention my portfolio of assets, which is quite comparable to the wealth of many people here. But I won't, because it's not about money, it's about respect. It's about integrity. It's about family values. I looked at James, who still looked stunned. "Son, I've always respected your life choices, even when I didn't agree with them. I have never been ashamed of you. I wish you could say the same about me." Then I turned to Clara. "Clara, I wish you and James happiness. I hope your marriage will be based on mutual respect and honesty, not on what seems prestigious or socially acceptable." Finally, I turned to the Richardsons. "Richard, Victoria, thank you for your hospitality. Now that you know I am not a poor relation, perhaps you will see me in a different light. But it's not what you think of me that matters. It's how you feel about my son. I hope your opinion of him will not change now that you know that behind him is not a poor uncle from the provinces, but quite a wealthy father." There was absolute silence in the hall. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were fixed on me with expressions ranging from shock and disbelief to embarrassment and even admiration. "Thank you for your attention," I finished. "Enjoy the evening. After all, it's paid for." I handed the microphone back to the host, who looked like he didn't know what to do next, and walked down from the podium. As I passed the Richardsons' table, Victoria looked as if she had seen a ghost. Richard opened his mouth to say something, but couldn't utter a word. Clara stared at her plate, avoiding my gaze. And James. James looked at me with an expression that was a mix of shame, anger, and something else I couldn't quite pinpoint. Maybe realization, maybe regret. I didn't stick around to find out. I made my way across the room to the exit, feeling the stares of everyone present. Some of the guests were whispering, others looked visibly embarrassed, and still others seemed even glad for the unexpected turn of events that diluted the predictable flow of the evening. The girl organizer caught up with me in the lobby. "Mr. Eddington," she looked worried, "perhaps you should stay. I'm sure your son—" "My son knows where to find me," I interrupted her. "If he wants to talk, I'll be in my suite." I headed for the elevators, feeling a strange mixture of relief and heaviness. What I'd done couldn't be called revenge. Rather, it was a statement, an assertion of my dignity. I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my own son, belittle me or make me a laughingstock. As I walked up to the room, I couldn't help but think about the consequences of my action. Had I ruined my relationship with James for good? Or perhaps it was a necessary step toward a more honest, respectful relationship between us? How would the Richardsons react? Would they continue to plan the wedding? Or would my démarche cause them to reconsider their attitude toward Clara and James' union? I didn't know the answers to these questions. But one thing I did know was that I had done what I thought was right. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a humble businessman from Florida or an uncle from the country, but like myself, Benjamin Eddington, a man who had built a successful business, raised a son, and lived his life according to his principles. I spent a sleepless night in my hotel room, replaying the events of the previous evening in my head. Had I been too harsh? Had I overreacted? I didn't regret my decision to set the record straight, but I worried about the consequences for my relationship with my son. Whether I had broken something definitively with my public statement. Around 8 in the morning, the phone rang. I expected to hear James, but it was the receptionist girl. "Mr. Eddington, you have visitors. Mr. and Mrs. Richardson are asking if they can come up to see you." What a twist. I was wondering what brought them to my door so early in the morning. "Yes, let them through," I replied after a brief pause. I took a quick shower, got dressed, and barely had time to brew some coffee in my room when there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, I saw Richard and Victoria looking a lot less cocky than usual. "Benjamin, good morning," Richard began, extending his hand. "We hope we're not too early." "Oh, no, not at all," I shook his hand and stepped back, letting them into the room. "Coffee? I'd love some," Victoria replied with a friendliness I hadn't noticed in her voice before. We settled into the living room, part of the suite, me in the chair, the Richardsons on the couch. We drank our coffee in silence for a while, obviously considering how to begin the inevitably awkward conversation. "Benjamin," Richard finally said, "we've come to apologize for yesterday's incident. It was an unforgivable misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding," I repeated with a touch of irony. "You mean the fact that my own son introduced me as his uncle, and you readily adopted that image of a poor provincial relative?" Victoria lowered his gaze in embarrassment. "We didn't know that that he hadn't been frank with us about your position. My situation." I couldn't resist being sarcastic. "So if you knew I was a successful investor and not some provincial loser, you'd treat me differently?" Richard looked genuinely embarrassed. "Benjamin, we certainly made an error in judgment. But understand us too. James never told us about your business. He only mentioned that you lived in Florida and had something to do with investments. You assumed that if a man doesn't flaunt his wealth, he doesn't exist," I finished for him. "A classic mistake." Victoria nervously adjusted her pearl necklace. "We really were wrong, and I personally want to apologize for my arrogance. It's unforgivable." There was something resembling sincerity in her voice, but I couldn't help but notice the change in her attitude toward me after she learned of my financial capabilities. "I appreciate your apology," I said neutrally, "but I'm not here to impress you with my bank account." "Of course," Richard agreed hastily. "We're not talking about money, we're talking about respect. We were supposed to treat you with the utmost respect as James's father, regardless of your position." I nodded. It was a valid point, though I doubted its sincerity. "Where is James?" I asked. "I thought he'd be the first one to come over to talk." The Richardsons looked at each other. "James, he's in a difficult state," Richard answered carefully. "What happened yesterday was a serious shock to him." "I bet it was," I grinned. "It's not easy when your poor uncle suddenly turns out to be not so poor." "It's more than that," Victoria sighed. "He feels humiliated in front of all our friends and co-workers." It hit me. Humiliated? After he disowned me by introducing me as an uncle? How do you think I felt when my son disowned me in front of all those people? I asked quietly. Victoria looked ashamed. You're right, of course. What James did is unforgivable. But understand, he was always striving to fit in, to be accepted. At his father's expense. I shook my head. That's no excuse. Richard set his cup down on the table. Benjamin, let's look forward. What's done is done. Now we need to find a way to move on. After all, our children are planning to get married. And that brings us to the real reason for your visit, doesn't it? I looked right at him. You're afraid I'll refuse to finance the wedding after what happened. Richard blushed but didn't look away. That's not, well, not exactly. Victoria and I are perfectly capable of paying for the wedding, but it wouldn't be fair to take on all the expenses when you're clearly in a position to contribute. I laughed, not maliciously, more with weariness. It all came down to money as usual. I'm not backing out of my commitment, Richard. I'll pay for part of the wedding expenses, as the father of the groom should. But first, I need to speak to my son, alone. Of course, Richard agreed hastily. I'll tell him to... No, I interrupted. Let him come to me when he's ready. I'm not going after him. The Richardsons looked at each other, clearly not expecting this position. As you wish, Victoria said at last. But Benjamin, we really hope you'll be able to get along with James. He's a good boy. He's just too obsessed with status and prestige, I finished for her. Don't worry, I know my son better than you think. Despite his attempts to disavow me, the Richardsons left shortly afterward, leaving me with even more mixed feelings than before. On the one hand, their apology seemed sincere. On the other, their sudden respect for me was clearly due to an awareness of my financial situation rather than an understanding of my human worth. I spent the rest of the morning in my room reviewing business reports on my laptop and answering emails. My phone was silent. James didn't call. Around noon, there was another knock on the door. This time it was Clara, alone. Mr. Eddington. She looked nervous but determined. May I come in? I'd like to talk to you. I let her into the room, a little surprised by her visit. Of the Richardson family, Clara seemed the most aloof, and I hadn't expected her to come alone. Coffee, I offered. Oh, no, thank you. She sat down on the edge of the couch. I won't be long. I just wanted to, talk to you without my parents and James. I sat down across from her, waiting for her to continue. Yesterday, what you did, she hesitated, searching for words. It was very sudden. For you or for James? I asked. For everyone, she smiled weakly. But I wanted to say that I understand how you feel. What James did was wrong. I was surprised at her bluntness. How do you feel about all of this, Clara? She hesitated. At first I was shocked, then angry. At James, at my parents, even at you. But when I calmed down and thought about it, I realized James never really talked about you. And when he did, he always portrayed you as a humble, unremarkable person. And now I realize that he didn't create that image because that's who you are, but because he was more comfortable seeing you that way. It was an astute observation, and I nodded, recognizing her point. Do you love my son, Clara? She was a little embarrassed by the direct question. Yes, I do. But after yesterday, I saw something in him that disturbs me. This, his willingness to deny his own father for the sake of impressing. Don't judge him too harshly, I said, surprised at myself. Despite everything, I was still defending my son. James had always had this need to be accepted, to be approved of. Maybe it was my fault. I hadn't been able to give him enough self-confidence. But that doesn't excuse what he did, Clara said. You know, I've always admired James's confidence, his ambition. But yesterday, I saw that behind that confidence was insecurity, fear of rejection. I was impressed by her insight. Perhaps Clara wasn't just the beautiful doll from a wealthy family that she appeared to me when I first met her. Does James know you're here? I asked. No, she shook her head. He's in his apartment right now recovering. His parents have tried to talk to him, but he's not very receptive. He's mad at me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Yes, she answered honestly. But I think he's most angry with himself for putting himself in this position. We were quiet for a moment. Outside the window, we could see Central Park in the fall sunshine. People were walking, sitting on benches, living their ordinary lives, unaware of the dramas unfolding around them. Sunrum, Mr. Eddington, Clara broke the silence. I'd like to get to know you better. The real you, not the one James thought you were. It was unexpected, and I didn't immediately know what to say. Why? I finally asked. Because if I'm going to marry your son, I want to understand where he came from. What kind of family shaped him? And because yesterday I saw a man with principles and dignity, and I was curious what else I didn't know about my future father-in-law. I smiled. Perhaps Clara was smarter and deeper than she seemed at first glance. Well, let's go for a walk, I suggested. I'll tell you a little about myself. We walked downstairs and out into Central Park. It was a beautiful day, sunny but not hot, with a light breeze carrying the smells of fall leaves. I was born here in New York, I began as we walked along the path around the lake. Not a very well-to-do family from the Bronx. My father was a truck driver. My mother worked in a laundry. They were good people, but they never had much ambition or opportunity. So how did you become an investor? Clara asked. Setku. Through education, I answered. I was the first in my family to go to college. I got a scholarship to New York University to study economics. Studied, worked part-time, didn't sleep much. After college, I got a job at a Wall Street investment firm, one of those firms where young analysts work 18 hours a day for not a lot of money, but with the prospect of growth. And you grew up in that company? No, I shook my head. I worked there for 3 years and realized it wasn't for me. Too much intrigue, too much focus on the trappings of success, too little real creation. So I left and started my own firm. Started with minimal capital that I had accumulated working on Wall Street. And how did you succeed? Clara looked genuinely interested. I found my niche, I replied. Surni Morton. Technology startups. It was the late 80s, the beginning of the computer age. I realized before most people that the future was in technology, and I started investing in young companies with innovative ideas. Many of them failed, but some shot very well. We sat on a bench overlooking the lake. In the distance, we could see the skyscrapers of Manhattan glistening in the sunlight. And James? When was he born? James was born when my business started gaining momentum, I smiled, remembering. Laura, his mother, and I decided to move to Florida when he was about 2 years old. We wanted him to grow up in a calmer environment, closer to nature. Plus, the tax climate in Florida was more business-friendly. So how was it for him to grow up there, I wondered. Okay, I think. We had a beautiful house near the ocean. James went to a good school, played sports, had friends. We didn't live large, but we never needed anything. Then why did he? Clara didn't finish her question, but I understood what she was asking. Why is he ashamed of his origins? I shrugged. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe it started in college when he first encountered really rich peers. Maybe it's the influence of a certain circle in law school. Or maybe it's just part of his character, the desire to always be better, richer, more successful than he is. But you're really rich, Clara said. Judging by the fact that you were able to pay for such an engagement, I smiled. Yes, I'm not poor, but it's not the amount of money in the account, Clara. It's about money, about status, about the trappings of success. I always taught James that it's not what you have, it's who you are. That character is more important than a bank account, that a man's real value is in his actions, not his image. But he didn't learn that lesson, she said quietly. No, I sighed. At least not yet. We sat in silence looking out at the lake. The ducks swam near the shore, occasionally diving for pieces of bread that an older man on a nearby bench tossed to them. You know, Clara finally said, I grew up very differently. My parents always emphasized the importance of status, connections, the trappings of success. It mattered to them what school I went to, who I was friends with, how I dressed. Image was everything. And how did you feel about that? I asked with interest. I took it for granted, she shrugged. That's how everyone around me lived. But sometimes I felt that something was wrong, that there must be something more substantial, more real behind all the tinsel. I nodded, understanding her feelings. What do you want out of life, Clara? Besides marriage to James, of course. She looked surprised, as if no one had ever asked her that question before. Yeah, I'm not sure, she answered honestly. I studied art history in college and I loved it. I even thought about working at a gallery or museum, but my parents didn't think it was serious, more of a hobby than a profession. What does James think about it? He, he supports me, she said, but there was doubt in her voice, at least in words. But I feel that in reality, like my parents, he'd rather I was just the socialite wife of a successful lawyer, hosting receptions, doing charity work, supporting his career. And you're okay with that? I asked bluntly. Clara looked at the lake for a long time before answering. I don't know. Until yesterday, I thought it was. But now I'm not sure. I realized that my revelation at the engagement party had affected not only James, but Clara as well, making her think about her life, her values, her choices. Clara, I turned to her, I can't give you advice about your relationship with James. It's your decision. But I will say one thing, life is too short to live it according to someone else's script. If you want to work in a gallery, work. If you want to travel, learn something new, be creative, do it. Don't let anyone, not your parents or your husband, define who you are and what you're worth. She looked at me with astonishment, as if for the first time she was seeing a real person in front of her, not just Father James. Thank you, she said quietly, for being honest, for seeing me as a person, not just a match for your son. I just want you both to be happy, I replied, and that your happiness should be based on honesty and mutual respect, not on illusions and expectations. We stood up and walked slowly back to the hotel. On the way, Clara told me more about her interests, her favorite artists, and her dream of someday opening her own small contemporary art gallery. I listened to her with genuine interest, beginning to see her not as the spoiled daughter of rich parents, but as a young woman with her own dreams and aspirations, trying to find her way in a world that often suppresses individuality in favor of convention. At the entrance to the plaza, we stopped. Will you talk to James? She asked. If he wants to talk to me, I answered. The ball is in his court. She nodded, understanding. Ah, I hope you two make up. No matter what, I know he loves you and values your opinion, even if he doesn't show it. Thank you, Clara, I smiled. And thank you for the honest conversation. It was refreshing. She smiled back and, to my surprise, lightly hugged me goodbye. See you later, Mr. Eddington. Benjamin, please, I corrected. Irikum, if we're going to be a family, let's dispense with the formalities. See you later, Benjamin. She nodded and headed for the waiting cab. I returned to the room with a surprisingly light heart. Talking to Clara had given me hope that maybe all was not lost, that behind the facade of the Richardson family lurked not just ambition and snobbery, but real feelings, real people, and that perhaps James had indeed found in Clara not just a suitable party, but a kindred spirit. But thoughts of my son still troubled me. Why hadn't he come? Why had he sent first the Richardsons, then Clara, but not himself? Was his shame so intense that he couldn't bring himself to face me? Or was his anger so deep that he didn't even want to see me? I walked to the window, looking out at Central Park, the city that had once been my home. At this moment, I missed Laura especially acutely. Her wisdom, her ability to find common ground with my son, even in the most difficult situations. She would have known what to do, what to say, how to fix what seemed to be irreparably screwed up. But Laura was gone, and I had to deal with this situation on my own. And the first step was for James to take. I couldn't and wouldn't go after him, begging for forgiveness for simply protecting my dignity. If he truly understood how wrong his behavior was, he had to find the courage to admit it and apologize. And only then could we begin to rebuild what had been destroyed. By evening, I was tired of waiting. James never called, never wrote, never showed up. I knew I had to give him time, but patience had never been my strong suit. After weighing the pros and cons, I decided to make the first move myself. I called his cell phone. It took a long time, and I thought he wouldn't answer. But on the 8th ring, his voice came through. Yes, dry, unemotional. Not, hi, Dad, not, I'm glad you called. Just, yes. I felt the irritation building inside me, but I suppressed it. James, "We need to talk," I said calmly. "About what?" The challenge in his voice. "About how you humiliated me in front of all my coworkers and future in-laws?" It wasn't the tone I was expecting. Not remorse, not embarrassment, but accusation. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'd rather discuss this in person than over the phone," I replied. A pause, then, "Okay, I'll be at your place in an hour." He disconnected without waiting for my response. I put the phone away, having mixed feelings. On the one hand, I was glad he'd agreed to meet. On the other, his tone didn't bode well for an easy conversation. An hour later, there was a knock on the door. I opened it and saw James, tense, with a hard expression on his face, wearing a perfectly pressed suit, as if he were going to a business meeting, not a conversation with his father. "Come in," I stepped back, letting him into the room. He walked inside, stopping in the middle of the living room without sitting down. "So?" he asked, folding his arms across his chest. "What did you want to talk about?" I suppressed the urge to respond harshly with harshness. One of us had to be the adult, and it looked like that role had fallen to me today. "Sit down, please," I pointed to the couch. "This conversation might take a while." He reluctantly complied, sitting down on the edge of the couch, his whole demeanor showing that he wasn't going to be long. "James," I sat down across from him, "I want to understand what happened. Why did you introduce me as your uncle?" He didn't look me in the eye, his gaze was directed somewhere else. "I don't know," he finally answered. "It was stupid, I admit." "Stupid?" I shook my head. "It was more than stupid, James. It was betrayal." He flinched at the word, but he straightened, his face impenetrable again. "I didn't betray you," he said with a note of irritation in his voice. "I was just trying to simplify things." Simplify? I couldn't believe my ears. "Disowning your father is a simplification? You don't understand." He stood up and paced around the room. "These people, they have certain expectations. They judge by looks, by manners, by connections. And you've always refused to play by those rules. And you decided it was better to lie than to explain why your father preferred a modest lifestyle?" I could feel my anger rising. "Yes," he turned to me, his eyes sparkling, "because they wouldn't understand. They'd think you were some kind of weirdo, an eccentric, or worse, a loser who tried to compensate for his complexes with a money-is-no-object philosophy. Do you have any idea what that would do to my reputation? My prospects at the firm?" I was stunned by his words. Was my reputation so much more important to him than our relationship? "Your reputation," I repeated slowly. "You're so ashamed of me that you're willing to give up your own father for your reputation." "I'm not ashamed of you." He sat up again, running a hand through his hair. I just, I just don't want your strange principles to interfere with my career. You can afford to be principled. You already have everything you need. I'm just starting out." "You're a lawyer at a prestigious firm, James," I reminded him. "That's hardly the beginning of the journey." "There's always a next step in this world," he countered. "Senior partner, board of directors, maybe even politics someday. And at each step, it matters who you are, where you come from, who you know." I looked at my son and didn't recognize him. When did he become so cynical, so obsessed with status and position? "I didn't raise you for this," I said quietly. "I taught you to value honesty, integrity, human relationships." "Yes, you taught me all those beautiful things," his voice was full of sarcasm. "And where did that lead you?" "To a lonely life in Florida, to an office that looks like something out of the 90s, to a lack of real connections in a world where decisions are made." I felt something snap inside of me. My son didn't just not share my values. He actively despised them. He considered them a sign of weakness, of failure. "Do you think my life is a failure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The company I'd built from scratch? The investments that helped launch dozens of successful startups? The people whose lives I've made a difference in? I'm not saying you're a failure," he softened his tone, "but you could have accomplished so much more if you weren't so principled, if you didn't refuse to play the games that everyone plays. The games where people use each other as stepping stones." I shook my head. "No, thank you. I prefer my lonely life in Florida to what you call success. And you want me to make the same choice? He looked at me with a challenge. Give up ambition? The opportunity to change the world at a higher level? I want you to be honest with yourself and with others, I answered. I want you not to betray your loved ones for the sake of opportunity. I want you to realize that a person's true worth is not measured by their status or connections. James laughed, but there was no mirth in his laughter, only bitterness. You live in a different world, Dad. A world where you can afford such luxuries as principles. My world is different, where you have to be tough, pragmatic, willing to compromise. Including compromising your conscience? I asked. He didn't answer, avoiding my gaze. I sighed and walked to the window. New York City spread out below. Bright, noisy, merciless. A city I had once loved and left because I didn't want its values to become mine. A city that seems to have completely consumed my son. Remember when you were 10 and your mom and I took you camping in the national park? I asked without turning around. In our 3 days without internet, without TV, without all the conveniences you were used to. You protested at first, saying it would be awful, and then you didn't want to leave. I was a kid, he replied. Children like adventure. This isn't about adventure, James, I turned to him. The point is that away from all the trappings of modern life, all the artificial status markers, you were just happy. Happy to be yourself, without having to prove anything to anyone. I was happy because I was 10 years old and I didn't understand how the world worked, he countered. I do now. And how do you think the world works? I asked. Like a food chain, he answered without hesitation. Either you eat or you are eaten. Either you use others or others use you. I prefer to be at the top of that chain. I looked at my son and didn't recognize him. Where had the sensitive, sincere boy Laura and I had raised gone? When did he turn into this cynical, calculating man? Your mother would be disappointed, I said quietly. The words hurt him. I saw his face twitch, as if he'd been slapped. Don't you dare, he hissed. Don't you dare use Mom against me. I'm not using her, I replied calmly. I'm just stating a fact. Laura believed in kindness, in honesty, in the idea that everyone had value that didn't depend on their position in society. She wouldn't have understood your decision to disown your father for the sake of reputation. She would have understood. His voice rose. She always understood me better than you. She knew I couldn't be like you, that I had other ambitions, other dreams. So, ambitions and dreams are fine, James. I took a step toward him. But when they make you betray your family, your roots, they cease to be worthy. And your ostentatious modesty, your disregard for status symbols, isn't that the same betrayal? He stood up too, his face only a few centimeters from mine. Nafuri, a betrayal of everything you could have given to your family but refused because of your principles. What could I have given but didn't? I was genuinely surprised. You had everything. A nice home, education, traveling, support, but not status, he was almost shouting. Not connections, not social standing. You could have been one of those people who open doors, who are listened to. Instead, you chose to be a nobody, just another guy with money who thinks it makes him special. I stepped back, stunned by his words. Was that really how he perceived my choice? As a refusal to give him what he thought was important? I never thought of it that way, I admitted. I always thought I was giving you the freedom to choose, to determine your own path without being tied to my name or status. Freedom of choice, he laughed bitterly. You know what gives you true freedom of choice? Power, connections, the ability to open any door with one call. That's real freedom. And what you call freedom is really just lack of opportunity. I sat down feeling suddenly tired. We were speaking different languages, operating on different values. For me, freedom had always been internal freedom to be myself, to make choices based on my principles, not on external expectations. For James, freedom was external, the ability to get what he wanted through status and connections. I can't change who I am, James, I said finally, and I don't want to. I've lived my life according to what I believe in. I've built a company that not only makes a profit, but helps people realize their ideas. I've never used others as tools to accomplish my goals, and I've always tried to be honest with myself and with those around me. "And what has that gotten you?" he asked. "Peace of mind," I answered simply. "Confidence that I can look in the mirror and not be ashamed of who I see." "Should I be ashamed?" There was a challenge in his voice. "That's for you to decide." I looked him straight in the eye. "Are you proud that you disowned your father in front of your important friends?" He looked away. "No," he answered quietly. "I'm not proud of it, but I don't regret my choice. At that moment, it seemed necessary." "Necessary?" I repeated bitterly. "Well, I'm glad you're at least being honest about it." We sat in heavy silence. It was beginning to get dark outside the window, and the lights of New York were slowly coming on, creating that unique cityscape I'd once loved so much. "You know," James finally said, "I always thought that one day you would understand, that you'd see the world through my eyes and realize that I was right, that all these connections, all these status symbols, all these games, they make sense. They work. And I always thought that one day you'd realize that behind all that glitter, there's a void," I replied. "That real value doesn't come from the outside, but from within." We were silent again, each absorbed in his own thoughts. I looked at my son and saw in him not just an extension of myself, but a separate person with his own values, his own ambitions, his own path. A path I could neither accept nor understand. "What will happen next?" he finally asked me. "After everything that happened at the engagement party?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. "It depends on you, on Clara, on your plans." "The Richardsons are shocked," he said. "Ah, they didn't expect my father to turn out to be a wealthy man. And now they don't know how to deal with the fact that I distorted the truth about you a little." "And Clara?" I asked. "How did she react?" "She's disappointed," he said with difficulty. "She said she didn't recognize me. She doesn't understand how I could do that." "Do you?" He was silent for a long time before he answered. "I realize I did it out of fear. Fear that they would see me as I had always seen myself. Not good enough, not important enough, not my own enough. I wanted them to accept me without reservation, to see me as one of them. And I was afraid that you, with your principles and simplicity, would shatter that illusion." It was probably the most honest admission I'd heard from him in a long time. "James," I stepped forward, "you're good enough the way you are. Without all the mask, without all the pretense. Just being yourself. But what if me isn't good enough?" There was an unexpected vulnerability in his voice. "What if, without all that facade, I'm just nobody?" I realized that behind all his arrogance, behind all his ambition, there was a deep fear. Fear of being rejected, fear of being unworthy. And instead of facing that fear head on, he had built a wall of status symbols, connections, reputation around him. "You're not a nobody, James," I said quietly. "You're my son, Laura's son, a smart, capable man with his own strengths and weaknesses. And that's enough. It's always been enough." He stood up and walked to the window, turning away from me. "Maybe for you, but not for the world I live in." "Then maybe you should reconsider what kind of world you want to live in," I replied. "And with whom?" He turned to me, and in his eyes I saw not anger, not defiance, but deep weariness and something akin to regret. "It's too late for that kind of change, Dad. I made my choice a long time ago, and I'll live with the consequences." He headed for the door, but stopped halfway out. "I realize that after what happened, you probably don't want to finance the wedding. That's okay. The Richardsons and I can handle it." "And it's not about the money, James," I said. "It's never been about the money." "I know," he nodded without turning around. "For you, it's always been about principles, integrity, about integrity. All these things I obviously didn't inherit." "You could have," I said quietly. "If you wanted to." "Maybe," he shrugged. "But I don't. I've chosen my path, and it's not your path." With those words, he opened the door and walked out without saying goodbye. I was alone in the room, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness that my son and I had traveled so far apart that we seemed to speak different languages. And relief that finally all the cards were laid on the table, all the masks removed. James had made his choice, and that choice didn't include me or my values. And as painful as it was, I had to accept it. Not because I approved of his choices, but because they were his choices, his life, his path. I went to the window and took a long look at the city below. Bright, noisy, relentless New York City. The city that had once been my home, and that was now my son's home. Cities don't change, I thought. It's the people who live in them that change, accepting the rules of the game or creating their own. James chose to accept the rules. I chose to make my own. And now we were separated not just by the geographic distance between New York and Florida, but by a much deeper chasm, a chasm between two irreconcilable worldviews. I woke up the next morning with a clear sense of what I had to do. I had spent the night after my difficult conversation with James almost without sleep, replaying our dialogue, his words, his choices. I packed my things, packed my suitcase, and sat down at my desk to write a letter. Not an electronic one, but a real one, on paper. In the age of digital communications, there was something symbolic about putting my thoughts in ink on paper. Dear James, I began, after our conversation yesterday, I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be a father, about my responsibility to you and to myself. It became apparent yesterday that our values have diverged to the point where we can barely understand each other. You have chosen a path that I can neither endorse nor share. I've decided not to fund your wedding, not out of pettiness or resentment, but because I cannot support a union based on pretensions and illusions. I have also decided not to attend the ceremony. This does not mean that I cease to be your father or that my door is closed to you. If someday you decide that honesty and sincerity are more important than outward gloss and status, I would be happy to restore our relationship. Love no matter what, your father. I reread the letter twice, folded it, put it in an envelope and sealed it. Then I called the front desk and had the envelope delivered to the Richardsons' room. Checking out of the hotel, I took a cab to the airport. In the car, I called Emily, my assistant in Florida. Ben, how was New York? How'd the engagement party go? Not exactly according to plan, but it's a long story. I'm coming back today. Can you cancel all my appointments for the next 2 days? There was concern in her voice. Of course. Is it something serious? Let's just say I found out that my son and I live in different realities. I understand. I'll reschedule all the meetings. And I'll order you dinner from that Italian restaurant. Thank you, Emily. You know me too well. When the plane landed in Florida, I felt strangely relieved. Like I wasn't just going home, but back to myself, back to my true life. At home, I was surprised to find a vase of flowers and a bottle of my favorite whiskey on the table, and Emily's promised dinner from an Italian restaurant in the refrigerator. I poured myself a whiskey, took a glass, and went out onto the terrace. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was Richard Richardson. Benjamin, I just spoke to James. He showed me your letter. I don't understand. After everything that's happened, you're just reneging on your commitment? I'm not abandoning my son, Richard. I'm refusing to support his choices, which I think are wrong. But the wedding, we've already started planning. I'm sure you can handle it. After all, you didn't count on my involvement in the first place, did you? Benjamin, I understand that you and James have had your differences, but this is his wedding, his big day. One he wanted to spend without his real father, I added, preferring to think of me as his uncle. He made a mistake. Young men often make mistakes. But should we punish him so harshly? I'm not punishing him, Richard. I simply refuse to participate in the farce. You're breaking your son's heart. He may never forgive you. He may, but I prefer to be honest with myself and with him. Think again, Benjamin. For James. For his future. I've already thought about it. My decision is final. Tell James I love him, but I won't be at the wedding. I ended the call and turned my phone off. The next day I went back to work. That evening, Clara called. Benjamin, it's Clara. I hope you don't mind me calling. Not at all. How are you? Honestly, confused. James showed me your letter, and I wanted to understand. What was it? Why you're not coming to our wedding? Clara, James has made his choice. He's chosen a world where status and glamour trumps honesty and family, and I can't support that choice. But can't you just accept him for who he is? Accept it, yes, but not actively support it, not pretend that I approve of his choices. What if I told you that James has changed since the engagement? Did he tell you that himself? Not exactly, but I can see that he's sorry. Regret what he did or the consequences? I don't know, but I know he loves you. Clara, I appreciate you trying to reconcile us, but some things can't just be swept under the rug. I understand that. I just wanted to try. For James, and for you too. Thank you. You're a good girl, Clara. I hope James appreciates that about you. A few days later came a letter from James. Dad, I got your letter and I understand your position. I'm not asking you to change your mind. I just want you to know that the wedding will take place in December as planned. The Richardsons will cover all expenses. I hope that one day you can forgive me. James. No apology, no admission of error. I didn't bother to respond. Life went on. I invested in new startups, counseled young entrepreneurs, occasionally took my boat out. I lived my normal life, the same life that James considered weird and reclusive, but that brought me fulfillment and peace. Yet thoughts of my son never left me. Sometimes I wondered if I had been too strict, but then I remembered his words, his willingness to renounce me for status, and I realized that my decision was the only possible one. 3 weeks before the wedding, I received a formal invitation with a handwritten note. We hope for your presence. R and W. Richardson. No personal note from James. I put the invitation aside, not intending to respond. That same evening, I received a message from Clara. I hope you got the invitation. I really wish you could have been there. James too, although he's too proud to admit it. I replied briefly, thank you for your concern, Clara, but my decision remains the same. On the day of the wedding, I woke up early and sat on the terrace for a long time, watching the sunrise over the ocean. My phone lay nearby, turned off. Today was the day my son was starting a new life, a life in which I, by his choice, played only a marginal role. I decided to spend the day on the ocean, away from anything that might remind me of the wedding. I took my speedboat and traveled along the coast, just enjoying the freedom, the sunshine, and the sound of the waves. Somewhere in the middle of the day, I stopped the boat and just lay on the deck looking up at the cloudless sky. I thought about money, the power it gives, and the illusions it creates. I'd always thought that I'd secure James's freedom through my financial ability. But in the end, that same money became a trap for him. It opened the door to a world where character and deeds were not valued, but only the outward manifestations of success. And maybe the decision not to fund his wedding was the last thing I could do for him as a father. The last lesson I could teach him. Money can't buy true respect, true love, true connection between people. I didn't know if James would ever learn that lesson. I didn't know if we would ever be truly close again. But I did what I thought was right. I stayed true to myself, to my values, to my understanding of what it meant to be human. It was already evening, back home, and I was out on the terrace again. I thought about my son, who was now probably dancing with his new wife, surrounded by the important people of the Richardson world. I hoped he was happy. Despite our differences, I sincerely wished him happiness. But I also knew that true happiness doesn't come from the outside. It's not in status, recognition, wealth, or connections. It is within us, in our ability to be true to ourselves, to our values, to our understanding of what is truly important in this life. And if James ever realizes that, my door will always be open to him. In the meantime, I was getting back to my life, my job, my friends, my house by the ocean. And there was a form of richness in that, in being able to live according to your principles without compromising what you really believe in.